Resilience. The sock gods don't let us be happy for long, Gina Locklear said. It was May 2019, and the state legislature of Alabama passed a near-total ban on abortion. Pro-choice groups organized an economic boycott of the state. A hashtag boycott Alabama gained traction on social media, and major news outlets picked up the story. Along with broiler chickens and Mercedes-Benz, Gina's socks got caught up in the protest. Customers emailed her, wanting to know her position on abortion before they would buy from her. Gina didn't comment publicly. She wanted to leave politics out of it and sell to everyone, but the ban caused her stress and hurt sales. That fall, she dropped the Little River line. She was trying to streamline her life and business, take some things off her plate. She hired a freelance designer, a woman who lived in New York who knew how to code sock patterns, a rare and specialized skill. That took some weight off Vance, whose Parkinson's was really slowing him down now. Gina was still driving from Birmingham to Fort Payne every week, leaving early Monday and getting home late Wednesday, driving back and forth between home and home. It was a balancing act, one she often struggled to get right. It turned out to be a good thing that she'd cut out the second line, because a much bigger crisis was looming. 6 months later, COVID hit. The pandemic threatened both sides of the company, sales and manufacturing. On Instagram, Gina followed the boutiques that carried her socks, and she could see stores closing up in a panic, one after the other, from the West Coast to the Northeast. A lot of her wholesale orders didn't ship out in March, April, and May. No orders went out in June. On the manufacturing side, suppliers closed. Gina got a call from her North Carolina cotton spinner, telling her they were shutting down for 4 weeks. The plant that dyed her yarn, also in North Carolina, halted operations as well. How could she make socks without yarn? In time, the critical shortages would extend to such items as ventilators, medicine, home appliances, semiconductors, cars, baby formula, and tampons. But they began with clothing. In early March 2020, during the pandemic's first wave, hospitals and walk-in clinics across the country reported limited supplies of masks, gowns, gloves, eye shields, and other personal protective equipment, or PPE. In an internal memo, executives at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in Manhattan acknowledged that the hospital had just a week's supply of surgical masks for its healthcare workers, several of whom had already tested positive for COVID-19. When a pediatrician in upstate New York tried to get masks for the employees of his 8-office physician group and called around to suppliers, he discovered that everything was on back order. On March 18, Dr. Stephen Anderson, an emergency physician at a hospital in the Seattle area, where the first U.S. case of COVID-19 was reported along with the first death, went on Good Morning America to let the nation know that he and his frontline colleagues desperately needed protective clothing. "I've got my mask for today right here, and I'm guarding it with my life," Dr. Anderson told host George Stephanopoulos, "because it could be my life." A new term entered the public lexicon, N95. Few outside construction or ICU workers had previously heard of the respirator masks, which could filter out 95% of airborne particles, but now they were the single best thing to protect you from getting deathly sick. The demand for N95s was insatiable. Nurses and doctors were supposed to wear one mask per patient visit, then toss it for a new one. Across the country, that amounted to millions per day. And everyone else suddenly wanted an N95, or a stash of them. But the world's supply of PPE seemed to have mysteriously dried up. According to the supply chain manager for Sloan Kettering, the hospital hadn't received a fresh shipment in a couple of months. China made much of the PPE that American hospitals used, and since the initial outbreak of the virus in the city of Wuhan months earlier, the country had been stockpiling it. In the critical period before the rest of the world woke up to the seriousness of COVID, China bought 2 billion masks from foreign countries, sucking up the global supply, much of which had been manufactured in China in the first place. The country also banned the export of new masks its factories produced, as would more than 80 other countries that produced them, including European Union members. As the United States clamored for medical supplies, China ramped up its awesome manufacturing capacity, not for American hospitals but for its own domestic needs. Daily production of surgical masks was around 10 million at the beginning of February 2020. By month's end, Chinese factories were making more than 100 million masks each day. And not just Chinese factories. The communist government of Xi Jinping basically nationalized the factories of foreign companies, taking control of their workforces and production. A 5-story building in Shanghai was a big N95 manufacturing facility for the American firm 3M. When a New York Times reporter showed up there in early March, a worker told him where all the masks were going. They're being sent to hospitals in Wuhan. The U.S. government maintained a strategic national stockpile, but the number of masks it held, 12 million N95s and 30 million surgical masks, amounted to 1% of the estimated 3.5 billion masks needed to get the nation through 1 year of a pandemic. The stockpile also had inadequate supplies of gowns, gloves, face shields, test swabs, and ventilators. More than a month into the outbreak, with new cases and deaths rising sharply, there were stories of nurses washing and reusing the same masks for days, doctors wearing raincoats and snorkeling gear into emergency wards, an entire hospital floor with just a single gown. In New York City, an early epicenter of the crisis, nurses at one hospital wore trash bags as protective gowns. A 48-year-old nursing manager in the same hospital contracted the virus and died. With the city unable to get more gowns, Mayor Bill de Blasio put out a request to the New York Mets for rain ponchos. The solution seemed no less absurd than the one proposed by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which said that in lieu of N95s, nurses and doctors could tie bandanas around their faces. During a protest by healthcare workers outside a hospital in the Bronx, a young resident stood before the television cameras and said, her voice shaking, "Every day when I go to work, I feel like a sheep going to slaughter." Americans watching such harrowing scenes on the news were asking the same question. Why were doctors and nurses at the best hospitals in the richest country in the world wearing trash bags to work? The essential component of N95 masks, what keeps tiny virus droplets from getting into a person's throat and lungs, is a material called melt-blown non-woven fabric. It is the same material found in disposable diapers and sanitary pads. Melt-blowing is a complex manufacturing process in which polypropylene pellets are heated and stretched to create thin strands of plastic that can be made to form a dense mesh web. The layered material creates a filter through which air can pass but not particulates. If you don't control the manufacturing of this kind of material, you can't make the masks. Just a few decades ago, most medical protective gear worn in America, like most apparel, was made in America. But big medical supply distributors started sourcing from overseas factories in Asia to lower their costs and drive up profits. The hospitals those firms sold to didn't stockpile the gear, because it was cheap to purchase and expensive to store. Just-in-time inventory methods, which move goods only as they are needed, had always delivered more. We got focused on, if we can save a penny, let's get it all done in one part of the world, Bob Riney, the president of healthcare operations for Michigan's Henry Ford Health, told the Detroit News early in the pandemic. In 2019, China produced nearly half of the world's melt-blown fabric, the US around 15%. China also made the machines that could convert melt-blown textiles into wearable PPE. Prestige Ameritech, the largest US maker of N95 masks, sourced its material from third parties. To manufacture melt-blown material itself was a big financial risk. One machine cost $5 million, and how could a US company compete on price with China? Lidl Incorporated, a Connecticut company that did manufacture melt-blown fabric, operated a single production line at the start of the pandemic. As bodies piled up in refrigerated trailers outside hospitals and the elderly died alone in nursing homes, the American Medical Association called on the Trump administration to establish a new Manhattan Project to leverage every tool at its disposal to manufacture PPE and contain the spread of the virus. But America in 2020 was a very different country and economy than in 1942. The Trump administration did award a combined $134.5 million to four companies: O&M Halyard, 3M, Honeywell, and Hollingsworth and Vos to ramp up N95 production, but the masks wouldn't arrive for several months. Lidl would also receive a $13.5 million contract from the federal government to increase production, but a second production line wouldn't be up and running until the end of the year, and a third not until the following May. It didn't matter how much money the government threw at the problem. The wait to purchase a machine that could produce melt-blown fabric was by some estimates more than a year. So, instead, Americans watched as the vice president pleaded for private construction firms to donate respirator masks to hospitals and healthcare centers, and as the president's son-in-law orchestrated airlifts of masks, gloves, and gowns from Asia at an exorbitantly high cost to taxpayers and in coordination with the very same healthcare companies that had outsourced their purchasing and production. In the meantime, ICUs were running out of beds, and by the end of April, more than 1 million cases of COVID-19 had been recorded in the country. 2,000 Americans were dying every day. Kim Glass was following the shortage of medical supplies like everyone else. Glass grew up in western New York, in the blue-collar town of Lockport, where General Motors' Harrison Radiator Division plant shed thousands of jobs during the 80s and 90s through downsizing and automation. She came of age in that period of transition. Her family had lived in a 50s-style ranch house on a street where everyone lived in similar homes and worked at Harrison Radiator. But in the Lockport of her adulthood, poverty now ran so high that every student in the school district qualified for free breakfast and lunch. Glass had planned to become a social studies teacher, but instead, she thought, I need to be helping my community. I need to be in Washington, D.C. She worked for a local congressman, John J. LaFalls, and when he retired, in 2002, she heard about a guy in northern Maine who drove a forklift at a paper mill and had won a seat in the 108th Congress. She spent a decade as a staffer for that guy Mike Michaud working on Capitol Hill on issues of manufacturing and trade policy. Now, at 44, Glass was president of the National Council of Textile Organizations, or the NCTO, the largest textile industry trade group. In mid-March, she read an article in Politico about the shortage of lab materials for COVID-19 test kits. She had a friend who knew Peter Navarro, the director of trade and manufacturing policy for the Trump administration. She asked the friend, "Can you get word to the White House that I might have somebody who can make swabs?" That was how, hours later, Glass came to be on a conference call with the friend, Navarro, and Andy Warlick of Parkdale Mills, the North Carolina textile manufacturer. In addition to its yarn spinning division, Parkdale owned U.S. Cotton, which was the world's largest manufacturer of cotton swabs, producing more than $9 billion a year. Andy, like Glass, thought Navarro was going to ask him to make cotton swabs, to which he could have replied, "How many million do you want by next week?" Instead, Navarro said, "I need masks." The White House was looking for every type of mask: N95s, surgical masks, and reusable cloth options to offer people some measure of protection. Navarro wanted to know if the U.S. textile industry could make the reusable cloth kind on a quick turnaround. They would go into the strategic stockpile and then be distributed in coordination with FEMA to local communities across the country. "How many masks do you need?" Andy asked. Navarro told him, 600 million. Under the leadership of Andy's late father-in-law, Duke Kimbrell, Parkdale had grown from a one-mill operation in the 1960s into the largest cotton yarn spinner in North America, with more than a dozen plants in 8 states. Duke had started in the mill sweeping floors after school. He went on to serve in World War II, and after the war he used the GI Bill to get a degree in textiles at North Carolina State. When he orchestrated a leveraged buyout and became owner, in 1983, he kept the company private, which meant that he could pump money back into the operation without worrying about boosting the stock price to please shareholders. Parkdale automated its plants before its competitors. It developed relationships with Japanese and German textile machine manufacturers to install the most efficient, automated machines in the world. Through cost savings and efficiency, the company took business from other rivals. When Andy joined Parkdale from a job at Milliken, in 1984, he focused on operational systems, doubling down on innovation and quality. In the following decades, Parkdale got stronger, faster, and even more competitive, becoming one of the last big U.S. textile firms standing. Since yarn was the first input in making clothing, Andy knew everyone down through the supply chain. He hung up with Navarro and started calling around to his contacts, putting together a coalition. "Are you on board? How much volume can you do?" Andy's son, Davis, a vice president, and an executive named Charles Heilig worked on the logistics. Within 48 hours, Andy got back to the White House. Yes, the industry could do it. The coalition committed to make 600 million masks in 90 days. The pandemic was revealing a striking truth: the companies best able to help their fellow Americans during this crisis were the ones that still had factories in America. This was true not just of Parkdale's coalition but also across the apparel industry. New Balance retooled 2 of its shoe plants to produce medical face masks. Though Carhartt now made most of its clothing overseas, it still operated 4 cut and sew facilities in Tennessee and Kentucky, which would produce more than 2 million surgical masks and 50,000 gowns, the company said. Other companies had less effective responses. Gap, for instance, announced a plan to get masks, gowns, and scrubs to frontline workers through its Factory Partners Code for contract factories half a world away. But if you were resourceful and knew how to sew, a nearly lost skill in a world of click-and-shop fast fashion, the home could become a factory. That spring, an army of home sewers across the country began making masks for their fellow citizens. They collected fabric, cut it up, and stitched it together to aid healthcare staffers, police officers, EMTs, paramedics, and other frontline workers. The home sewers posted tutorials to YouTube for others to follow. Sewing groups with dozens of members sprung up to supply Riverside University Health System Medical Center in California and Allena Health's network of hospitals and clinics in Minnesota. The masks they produced weren't medical grade by any stretch. They were DIY designs, stitched together with a few layers of cotton, elastic straps, and maybe an insert cut from a coffee filter. Giovanna Porter, a sewer in rural Pennsylvania making masks for her niece, a doctor working in a coronavirus ward in New York, used the twist ties from garbage bags to form nose bridges. Crystal Douglas, the owner of Music City Sewing in Nashville, repurposed the elastic from her bra straps to make her mask bands. Michelle Hoagland, the owner of Treadle Yard Goods, a fabric store in St. Paul, gave away mask-making kits to more than 200 people who showed up at her store. Each kit contained a pattern and enough material to make 2 dozen. Hoagland was happy to do her part but angry, too. An army of home sewers using leftover fabric scraps. It was a throwback to the 1918 flu epidemic. It should never have come to this, Hoagland told the New York Times. We're doing what the federal government should be doing. As for the Navarro-led project, what remained of the domestic textile industry pivoted overnight to making masks. The Warlicks and one of their largest customers, Hanes Brands, helped coordinate the coalition of industry competitors. Hanes Brands leveraged their expertise in design to create tech packs, and their logistics department coordinated delivery. Other Parkdale customers such as Fruit of the Loom, Beverly Knits, and Sanmar joined the effort. Parkdale was also participating in other PPE programs at the same time, converting production lines to make polyester fiber for the tips of testing swabs and spinning specialized yarn for gowns. One cut and sew shop would contract out to another cut and sew shop, the work trickling down from the big players to the little guys. Factory owners heard about the project and reached out to Glass or the Warlicks. I've got 100 sewers in the garment district in New York. How do I get involved? They were eager to answer the call to action, and they also saw a way to avoid laying off their workers at a time when the whole economy had ground to a halt. It seemed like the entire U.S. textile supply chain was working on the mask program. Hundreds of companies ended up participating. They worked for Hanes, Sanmar, Beverly Knits, or Parkdale. The consolidation allowed a wide network of suppliers to participate while limiting the number of contracts the federal government would have to deal with. The participants charged the government less than 75 cents per mask. A few manufacturers chose to opt out because they could make masks on their own and net a lot more profit. It was a time of rapacious price gouging. I didn't want that in our coalition anyway, Andy said. We're Americans, and we're being called on. One of the companies that answered Andy's call was American Giant. Since the start of the outbreak, American Giant's revenues had fallen off a cliff. Online sales, which made up the bulk of the business, were down 50% through mid-March. The retail stores in San Francisco, New York, and Los Angeles were closed until further notice because residents in those cities were under orders to shelter at home. Civilization was collapsing. Who was buying a hoodie, anyway? Of pressing concern for Bayard Winthrop was the money that American Giant owed to its suppliers, finishers like Carolina Cotton Works, denim mills like Mount Vernon, for purchase orders already made. He also had 45 employees who were relying on a paycheck to support their families. The pandemic was a trial by fire for business leaders. A shutdown of the global economy was unprecedented, and some businesses weren't going to make it through. It was entirely possible that American Giant would be one of the casualties. Unable to go to the office, Bayard led a company-wide call every morning at 9 with his furloughed retail employees, the corporate staffers in the Bay Area, and the supervisors of the 2 sewing mills in North Carolina. Everyone but the supervisors and the seamstresses at those mills was working from home. He talked while doing laps around Fort Scott in the Presidio with his dog, amped up on caffeine and the drama of the moment. We're in a fucking tornado right now, he told them. He turned out to be a good leader in a crisis. He didn't panic and stayed optimistic in his gut. He believed COVID to be a temporary disruption. He didn't try to project false confidence. He was honest and upfront with people. The company promised to pay the furloughed retail employees through March, with no guarantees after that. Cash was everything right now. The situation shifted day to day. If things got worse, the company would have to start looking at layoffs in production, marketing, design, basically everywhere. Bayard's partners in the storm were Kent Kendall, his childhood friend and coup, a soft-spoken moral compass within the company, and Pete Din, the 48-year-old CFO. Pete and his parents and 7 siblings had come to the United States from Vietnam as boat people. After the fall of Saigon in 1975, like other refugees, the family had piled into an overcrowded fishing vessel, which drifted in the South China Sea for weeks until a South American freighter spotted it. Pete was 3. The Din family ended up in Philadelphia, where Pete's father started over with a job in the housekeeping department at Bryn Mawr Hospital, and Pete and his siblings worked hard and excelled in school, in the tradition of first-generation immigrants. Pete got a scholarship to a prep school in the suburbs, then got into Stanford to study economics, which brought him out to the Bay Area. Due to his background, he had a cautious streak, especially around money, and a methodical approach that made him the exact person you wanted beside you in a crisis. Bayard and Pete sat in a room for a day and came up with a doomsday plan. The goal was to buy the business enough time to allow sales to recover. The first thing they did was call all their suppliers to see how many orders could be cancelled, delayed, or partially paid. Going forward, any purchasing of raw materials would be made by senior leadership only, Bayard, Kent, or Pete. Having found they had some leeway with their suppliers, they turned to operational costs. They cut every unnecessary expense, travel, entertainment, services for an office that was sitting empty. But with such weak sales, that wasn't enough to keep the business going. Finally, they looked at payroll. If senior management took pay cuts for several months, they could prevent layoffs for that period. Bayard volunteered to take a 50% cut to his compensation. Pete had to convince him not to waive his entire salary, and Pete and Kent took substantial cuts as well. If the business continued to deteriorate beyond that period, Pete said, all bets were off. As dire as it was for American Giant, in some ways the company was in a stronger position than big apparel brands with global supply chains. Bayard and Pete were dealing with U.S.-based suppliers who were operating under the same set of rules and circumstances. The owners of those businesses had become true partners in some cases, friends. Bayard could get on the phone to Brian Ashby at CCW as he did in late March and say, I know we owe you $650,000, but can $150 get you through for a bit? A foreign factory owner they barely knew might not be so accommodating. Big apparel brands that manufactured overseas worked roughly a year in advance in their production schedules. The merchandise for next season fall 2020 was probably already on a boat crossing the ocean, on its way to retail stores that were either closed or empty. Retailers would soon grow burdened by piles of unsold clothing, all of it seasonally dependent and destined to be heavily discounted or liquidated. By contrast, American Giant controlled its manufacturing and could be flexible in the moment. Bayard could call up William Lucas, the plant manager at the Middlesex factory, and tell him to make only what the company had orders for. Or to drop every product from the line but basic black t-shirts. Or to stop clothing production altogether because American Giant was pivoting to masks. The call from Andy Warlick was the first sign that the business might weather the storm. Joining the coalition meant that the sewing plants could stay open as essential facilities, even if North Carolina enacted a shelter-in-place order, keeping the workers working. In late March, a note was posted to American Giant's Instagram account. Effective today, we are making masks and distributing them to the frontline medical personnel that are confronting this crisis. Our initial target is 35,000 per week, and we expect to be climbing aggressively from there. We ask for your patience and understanding as we stop production of American Giant products in support of this effort. You may experience some out of stocks in the coming weeks, but we trust that you will understand. Right now we need masks more than sweatshirts. The mask project was good for morale. The employees felt they were helping in some small way in a moment of fear and powerlessness, and the government contract provided desperately needed revenue to boot. Months later, many factory owners would tell Andy Warlick or Kim Glass that the mask program had saved them from bankruptcy. Not that Bayard had joined the coalition for financial reasons. In truth, he'd wanted to play a vital role his entire career, and coming as it did now, it seemed to vindicate everything he'd been shouting for the past decade. While the only option of most bigger and more profitable brands was performative gestures like the donation to coronavirus relief efforts Ralph Lauren made through its corporate foundation, American Giant was able to act quickly to offer tangible assistance. Another boost came one morning on the company-wide call, after Sharon Harris chimed in with an idea. As Sharon told the group, she'd been working from home one day when, distracted during a long Zoom call, she began browsing through her grandmother's handwritten recipe journals from World War II. Her family had lived in Sunderland, on England's northeast coast, during the wartime years of the Blitz and food rationing. Sharon was struck by the resourcefulness of her grand's recipes, the way every single bit of everything was used. She began to think about how that creativity in a time of hardship could be applied to making clothes. Every apparel brand that Sharon had ever worked for dumped its excess inventory, selling unused fabric and trimmings to jobbers and slashing the price of unsold garments to get rid of them. But American Giant, in its scrappiness and frugality, held on to leftover bolts of fabric and other raw materials, along with clothes that hadn't sold or had slight defects. It was all sitting on shelves in the back of the Middlesex factory. When Sharon started at the company, she'd asked a member of her design team to make an inventory list so she'd know they had 2,000 yards of this or that fabric or 600 zippers of a certain shade or type. Now she told the group, what if American Giant created a collection from all the inventory we have? Like cooking from what's in your pantry. Just like my gran, we shouldn't have anything sit and go rotten in the cupboards. Everyone loved her idea, and very quickly, using the inventory list and CAD software, Sharon worked up a collection of the brand's signature hoodies. She used loud colors that clashed on purpose, firehouse tones of orange and red, army greens, olive, and taupe, safety orange draw cords, making the mishmashed nature of the process a feature of the design. Some of the fabric had been hanging around since the company's beginnings. In the end, American Giant had about 2,000 men's and women's hoodies that cost next to nothing to make and told the story of a company grinding to survive. The hoodies went on sale that fall as the Vault collection. Sharon's grandmother's example rubbed off on the staff. As the weeks went by, it became a kind of game. How scrappy can we get? A stockpile of ribbed fabric was turned into a ribbed shirt program so that the brand could offer new products even as it tightened the belt. When the factory ran out of white buttons and couldn't get more, ivory was used instead. There were some boxes of clothes in one-off seasonal colors that hadn't sold. For 60 cents a yard, the fabric could be dyed black by CCW, resurrecting dead inventory. There was no way Levi's or J. Crew could put sweatshirts meant to be sold that season back on a boat to Vietnam for redyeing. Economist and businessman Mohammed El-Arian, the current president of Queen's College, Cambridge, had foreseen the post-COVID world early on, and in a May 2020 essay he published in Project Syndicate, he wrote that the corporate world's multi-decade romance with cost-effective global supply chains and just-in-time inventory management was effectively over. El-Arian, a skillful explainer of complex issues and a coiner of catchwords, went on CNBC and Bloomberg TV throughout the spring and summer to lay out the new paradigm under which companies needed to operate. The term he came up with was old hat to Andy Warlick, Sharon Harris, and every other person involved in making clothing domestically: resilience. One day in May 2020, Bayard was in his pickup truck driving around the Bay Area to drop off care packages with masks and thank you notes for his employees. The terror of those first days and weeks of the pandemic had mostly subsided. American Giant's business had stabilized and even strengthened. Sales that month were tracking 50% above the year before. Add in the mask program, and Bayard was feeling increasingly optimistic. He had noticed the beginnings of a rebound as early as the week that Tom Hanks got COVID and the NBA suspended the rest of its season, when it felt like the whole world was tipping on its axis. Bayard was trying to go easy with the marketing, to walk a fine line between recognizing that people were dying and needing to sell clothes. Amid all that confusion and fear, American Giant had sent out a promotional email about a track pant. Within 15 minutes, the company saw an uptick in sales. It was odd. But in retrospect, it was the beginning of a profound shift in work life, the birth of the work-from-home economy. And the new work uniform was sweatpants and hoodies. We are the beneficiary of a bunch of factors it would have been hard to predict or plan for. We're in the category that people are buying, Bayard said, pulling up to Pete's house in the Richmond district. By then, many apparel brands were in deep trouble. J. Crew, JCPenney, and Neiman Marcus had filed for Chapter 11. Gap had stopped paying rent on all its stores and said it wouldn't reopen some of them. The direct-to-consumer brands Rothy's, Everlane, and Third Love all announced layoffs and furloughs. Many businesses will perish, Bayard said as he hopped back in his truck and headed over to Oakland to deliver another care package. Some will emerge stronger. We are determined to be one of them. Going into the summer of 2020, American Giant was doing brisk business, and the problem now occupying Bayard's thoughts was how to produce more clothes, because the company had stopped buying raw materials when the pandemic hit. We're sold out of sweatpants, he said. We can't chase that business. We have no ability to make that shit right now. Flush with government stimulus checks and stuck at home, Americans were going on online shopping sprees, buying sweatpants, hoodies, and other leisure wear. None of Bayard's employees lost their jobs that spring and summer, and by winter, he would be hiring to fill several positions. American Giant seemed weirdly purpose-built to prosper during a global pandemic. Gina Locklear didn't turn to mask-making. Sock machines are very specific, limited as they are to producing socks, but she, too, came through the pandemic surprisingly well. After she got through freaking out, she returned to her habitual state of shrewd resiliency. You needed that quality to function in the field even in normal times, so in a way, Gina was well prepared for this unprecedented crisis. The cotton spinner and yarn dyer she worked with were small family businesses like MEG. Together they would figure something out. Everyone is going through the same situation, she told herself. And, honestly, we have it good because we make our own socks. She was hearing that brands that manufactured in contract factories overseas were dealing with huge supply chain challenges. At least she still had a stock of yarn. We could make some adjustments with our fall line in terms of colors if our suppliers don't open right back up. Her pre-existing e-commerce platform was another silver lining. As pandemic-era shopping shifted online, Gina noticed an uptick in her sales. Countless media outlets, including fashion sites like Refinery29, published articles about how to help small businesses during the crisis. People want to support not only businesses who make their products in the United States but small businesses, Gina said. We feel that. We have very loyal customers who we hear from who want to make sure we keep making socks. Another thing she had going in her favor, socks are a cozy essential, an item people stock up on when they're sheltering. And, Gina reasoned, I think the bright, happy patterns were a good thing, especially during that time. Someone actually told me that the brightness of our socks made them feel better when they looked at their feet. So loyal customers were ordering her socks, but she was gaining a lot of new customers, too. Christmas 2020 sales were surprisingly good, up almost 30% from the year before. The pandemic hadn't killed her business. It had made it stronger. But just days into 2021, one of those time bombs that had been ticking in the background exploded. Gina was in the kitchen at the mill, going over samples for Zcano's spring line, when Vance walked in. He'd just spoken to her parents. He repeated to Gina what he'd told them he was putting in his notice. At 52, he went home after his shift each day and got straight into bed because he was so worn out from his Parkinson's. The time during the workday when he felt good was getting shorter and shorter. His mind wasn't as sharp as it used to be, and twice he'd fallen at work. That's what had prompted his decision. I didn't get hurt or nothing, but I'm lucky I didn't, Vance told me when I visited Fort Payne again that May. When you start thinking you might cause problems for the mill, it's time to move on. The way Vance delivered the news, in a tone of finality, added to Gina's upset. Her whole face fell, and she burst out crying right in front of him. Vance said he would stay until December, giving the Locklears almost a full year to find and train his replacement. But to the family, especially Gina, he was irreplaceable. She couldn't have started Zcano without him, and she didn't know how she could continue without him. It takes many, many years to gain the kind of knowledge that he has, Gina said. You don't just put on a style that you've run before and think it's going to run perfectly. You might get a hole in the toe. You don't know why. Sometimes the machines run well, sometimes they don't. You just have to constantly figure that type of stuff out. And someone who doesn't know the machines well can never figure it out. As she welcomed me into her office, Gina's face was a picture of worry, and her voice quavered. She sighed and brought up my first visit to Fort Payne, back in 2016 when she'd recently won the Martha Stewart Living Award and everything was looking up. Things were happy then, she said. I'm in a place of stress right now. The Locklears began the search for Vance's replacement. Terry called around to his hosiery friends, asking if there was someone still working in the mills who fit the bill, but he exhausted his leads pretty quickly. Gina heard about an organization called the Manufacturing Solutions Center, in Conover, North Carolina, which is part of Catawba Valley Community College. Its stated mission is to help U.S. textile manufacturers increase their sales and efficiency and find skilled workers. She called the center one day to pick an expert's brain about how to find a new tech. The person she spoke to told her, my advice is you just keep the one you have. Aside from Vance, she had another staffing crisis looming. The New York-based freelance sock designer with whom Gina worked had told her she was looking for full-time employment. In an ideal world, Gina would have hired the woman permanently, but she couldn't afford to pay a big city salary. It was only a matter of time before her designer would leave her, too. For years, Gina had worried about orders drying up and putting her out of business. But now she worried about workers. And she realized that problem was more dire. You could create new business. You couldn't invent someone with 30 years of experience in the hosiery industry. One day, Gina thought of the most accurate word to describe what it was like being a U.S. clothing manufacturer, vulnerable. We are all vulnerable, she said. Even though we have all this business, we are vulnerable due to lack of skill set. It dawned on me this year. People leaving us could actually close us down. The previous fall, MEG had hired a new line knitter and fixer named Barry. Barry's family had once owned and operated a mill out in the countryside, and he'd grown up in the sock business, like Gina. Although he'd been working for the Locklears for only a short time, they decided that Barry would replace Vance as production manager. For several months, until Vance left, Barry would apprentice alongside him. He would try to fill very big shoes. Gina had reservations about Barry from the start, but she chalked it up to the fact that Barry wasn't Vance. In physical appearance and temperament, the two were opposites. Barry was in his late 40s, with a ready smile and a clean-cut look that masked a combustible side to his personality. He was a chatterbox. He could talk socks all day long. Mostly about the machines. He'd go deep into the weeds, explaining each intricate moving part and its purpose. When I was first introduced to him in the knitting room, Barry held up his hand to show me a childhood scar that ran across the tops of his fingers. He said he got the scar as a young boy, when he was helping his dad package socks with a sealer iron that didn't have a cover over the heating wire. The wire was set at 300-something degrees, and it burned me right down to the bone, Barry said, almost proudly. My sister, it burned her so bad it peeled her hand back a little bit. Her scar is wider than mine. Through that spring, summer, and fall, Vance and Barry worked side by side. One time, an overnight storm knocked the power out and caused the air compressor that powered the Lonatus to shut down. The following morning, Vance and Barry had to reboot every machine. Barry took to the challenge of coding in Gina's patterns on the computer. Just like Vance, he found it intellectually engaging. He's willing to learn, and that's the main thing, Vance said. Things were looking up. In November 2021, Gina was contacted by a producer from CBS News. The network wanted to send a crew down from New York for a segment about made-in-America products being so in demand during the pandemic, on account of the supply chain crisis. Gina's sales proved it. 2021 was turning out to be Zcano's best year ever. The TV spot would be a big deal. The mill was buzzing with anticipation. But on the day the film crew arrived, Barry showed up to work in a Trump t-shirt. He'd never worn anything with a political slogan before, but he seemed to want to make a statement to TV viewers. Terry asked him to please change his shirt. We can't be political here, Terry said. Barry left and never came back. They'd lost almost a year training him. With 6 weeks until Vance was due to retire, Gina did what she always did. She dug down and persevered. Kenny Young, the line knitter who worked for her parents, would take Vance's place, she decided. Kenny was 49, not young but not retiring anytime soon, and he was from the Fort Payne of the old school. He'd started in the sock mills at 15 and had worked for the Locklears going back to the Russell athletic days. Kenny was steadfast and loyal, like Vance. Someone Gina had known since childhood. And so Vance began a crash training course with Kenny. 6 weeks later, in January 2022, after making socks for more than half his life, Vance Veal walked out of the mill to start his new life. He stayed retired for 2 months. After running through all his fix-it projects at home, Vance grew bored. He kept wondering what was happening over on Airport Road. He talked to Terry, and they worked out a deal. Vance would return a few days a week to help out part-time and continue training Kenny. When Gina walked in one morning and saw Vance back in the knitting room, she burst into tears again. Tears of joy. Chapter 9.